You're looking at a photograph that was buried for over 150 years. At first, it looks harmless, just a little girl sitting in a Victorian chair. But if you stare long enough, something begins to feel wrong. Her eyes, they don't blink. And here's the terrifying part, she couldn't blink. According to secret medical records hidden in England's most restricted archives, this child didn't just suffer from insomnia, she never slept. Not once. For 847 days straight, this girl was awake, watching, waiting, until suddenly she vanished, erased from every official record as if she never existed. But this isn't just some ghost story. This is one of the strangest neurological mysteries in human history. To uncover the truth, we need to rewind the clock to Victorian London, 1868, a city exploding with progress and chaos. Imagine gas lamps flickering in the fog, factories choking the air, and behind it all a secret so terrifying doctors risked their careers to hide it. That's when the Ashford family arrived. 2 weeks of travel through England's frozen countryside, carrying their youngest daughter, the girl who never closed her eyes. Official files refer to her only as patient A1868. Her real name, censored, gone. The first signs appeared in 1867. One ordinary January night, she lay down to sleep. But when her mother tried to wake her the next morning, something was wrong. Not only was the child awake, she had never slept at all. Doctors at the London hospital couldn't believe it. This wasn't insomnia. This was something darker, something impossible. And here's the kicker. Every single day her body should have collapsed. But it didn't. Somehow, she kept going, trapped in a waking nightmare that defied science itself. And what happened next? That's where this story takes a horrifying turn, because the more doctors studied her, the stranger her condition became. Witnesses claimed she started to change, her stare growing colder, her presence unsettling. And then, just when the world was watching, she disappeared forever. Was she kidnapped? Hidden? Or did the British medical establishment bury the truth because it was too dangerous to reveal? One thing's certain, the mystery of the girl who never slept is far from over, and the biggest twist hasn't even come yet. Because deep in the archives, there's one final document, one that might prove she wasn't alone. The nightmare began one ordinary January night. A little girl goes to bed like any other child her age. But by morning, something unthinkable had happened. She was sitting upright, eyes wide open, staring at the wall with an intensity that her own mother described as unnatural. At first, the family thought it was just insomnia. But then came day 2, night 3, week 4. She didn't close her eyes, not once. And here's the most disturbing part, she wasn't tired. She was awake, always awake. Her parents tried everything: chamomile tea, warm baths, lullabies whispered through tears, even laudanum, an opiate so powerful it was used to knock patients into unconsciousness. Nothing worked. The girl just lay there, eyes locked on the ceiling as if watching something only she could see. When asked what it was, her answer sent chills down her mother's spine. "They are always here. They watch me when I watch them." 3 months passed, 3 months without a single second of sleep. By then the girl no longer played, no longer laughed, no longer spoke unless spoken to. She just observed, as if trapped in another world. Desperate, her parents sacrificed everything they had and set out for London. It was a journey that nearly bankrupted them, but their daughter's condition was spiraling beyond anything they could comprehend. Their destination, the office of Dr. Harrison Whitfield, one of Victorian England's most respected neurologists, a man who had built his reputation on solving the impossible. but even he wasn't ready for what he was about to witness. The moment Dr. Whitfield met the girl, he described it as profoundly disturbing. She sat perfectly still, unblinking, her gaze locked on an invisible point on the wall. And when she did blink, only once every 3 or 4 minutes, it was so unnatural, so inhuman, that Whitfield's blood ran cold. But here's the shocking twist. Every test came back normal. Her pulse, steady, breathing, perfect, body temperature, exactly where it should be, no malnutrition, no fatigue. Nothing that could explain why this child had been awake for months without collapsing. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. And if you think that's terrifying, wait until you hear what happened when Whitfield pushed the examination further. Because what he discovered next changed everything, and hinted that this girl's condition might not have been human at all. She didn't just stay awake, something inside her had been rewired. Reflexes like a predator, movements honed to a razor edge. When the nurse dropped a spoon, she snatched it before it hit the floor, fingers like clockwork. When asked to draw, she reproduced impossible geometry with the calm of a mathematician. Lines so precise the doctors whispered about it like it was a miracle or a threat. But precision wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how she existed between two worlds at once, painfully present and vanished. She answered questions with crisp, adult clarity, yet her eyes never left the corners of the room. It was as if she had taped herself to a spot in space and was monitoring something only she could see. Whitfield didn't trust hearsay. He set up a continuous observation protocol, 24/7 surveillance, the kind reserved for the most baffling cases. For 7 days, the girl stayed in the hospital under the eyes of physicians, nurses, and ledgers that would later be stamped restricted. Every test, every note, every scribble survived, and every single one confirmed the impossible. She did not sleep, not for a single minute during that week. Not once. Night after night, the nurses wrote the same unnerving details. Nurse Sarah Patterson, a veteran who had seen seizures, strokes, and the human body betray itself in a dozen cruel ways, signed her report with a hand that trembled. Between midnight and 6, she wrote, she did not close her eyes for more than a handful of seconds. She tracked movements through the air, turning her head slowly as if following something invisible. When Nurse Patterson asked what she saw, the girl whispered, "The night visitors. They come to check if I'm still watching." Night visitors. The phrase should have been dismissed as fevered nonsense. It was. The sightings were consistent, every 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. like clockwork. The girl described shadowy figures gliding close enough to breathe on the bedpost but never touch. They did not speak. They did not leave marks. They simply watched, and she watched them back compulsively, religiously, as if her survival depended on keeping eyes on them at all times. Whitfield's skepticism began to crack. A rational man, he tested everything: reaction times, sensory thresholds, caloric intake. She ate. Her weight held. Her heart cooperated. Her blood returned normal. But her nervous system hummed like a live wire, tone elevated, reflex arcs primed, motor control that baffled even the assistants. It was as if the body had been tuned for perpetual vigilance. Then the records reveal something darker. In the afternoons, when the ward was noisy and the sun carved rectangles on the floor, staff would sometimes glance away for a moment, just a moment, and when they looked back, the girl's eyes would follow a path that didn't match any sound or shadow. She was tracking something. Once, during a routine test, every instrument and observer recorded the same anomaly: a tiny, rhythmic fluctuation in the air near the foot of her bed, like a ripple. The technicians later argued over whether it had been a draft, a trick of the light, or something else entirely. Whitfield left that line in the file with a trembling question mark. This case was no longer a medical curiosity. It was a live wire under the floorboards of Victorian science, impossible, unsettling, and refusing any tidy explanation. The nurses kept writing, "They check if I'm watching." The girl kept saying, "If I look away, they get closer." And here's a fact that turns the stomach. While Whitfield and his staff documented the girl's heightened abilities, the micro-precision, the unbroken attention, the mechanical calm, they also recorded an alarming change in the girl's personality. She smiled less. Her voice thinned. She began to rank events by priority, every minute, every glance cataloged like inventory. It was not childhood, it was a mission. At the end of 7 days, the file closes on one last, bone-deep note from Nurse Patterson. "She does not sleep. She will not sleep. If anyone asks, remember the hours between 3 and 5. The entry was stamped and archived, and then, as the later documents show, certain pages were blacked out, redacted, gone. Pause, breathe, because the biggest twist hasn't come yet. The records hint at something worse than sleeplessness, an organized response from unknown sources, a regularity around the very hours the girl called the watch. Whoever or whatever the night visitors were, they weren't random. They followed a schedule. They checked on her like inspectors at a factory, like auditors of some hidden ledger. If you think this is spooky, wait. Because tucked between scientific observations and trembling nurse reports is an entry that suggests the girl's condition might have been contagious in a way no one could measure. Not contagious like a disease, but contagious like attention itself. The idea that someone watching invites another watcher, that vigilance breeds vigilance until the world folds inward on itself. Whitfield wrote the notion down as a possibility, and then struck it out. He was a man of reason, and he feared what admitting it would mean. What happened next ripped the case out of Whitfield's ledger and into the realm of legend. The girl disappeared from the hospital rolls. One morning she was gone. No note, no transfer, no record of discharge. The bed was made. The monitors idle. The ledger merely said, cryptically, "Patient A1868, status unresolved." That line is the hole in the story where nightmares crawl out. Did someone take her? Did she vanish? Did the institution decide the truth was too dangerous to publish? Whatever the answer, the photograph, the one that sat in an archive for 150 years, is the last undeniable piece of evidence we have. Those eyes, frozen, tell us that someone once watched and was watched back. You feel it, right? The pressure building like a countdown. Tick, tick, tick. The deeper we dig, the closer we get to something no one in 1868 was prepared to face. The stakes aren't just curiosity anymore. They are proof that an observation can become a trap, and that watching might be a contract you can never break. And if you think the disappearance is the climax, you're wrong. The file hides another note smaller, folded into the margins, almost invisible, that suggests A1868 may not have been the only child. That hint is where everything explodes. The biggest twist hasn't come yet. What started as a medical mystery was about to explode into something terrifying. Dr. Whitfield, once skeptical, began to notice something he couldn't ignore. The girl's eyes weren't drifting randomly. They moved with precision. The same spots, the same times, over and over, like she was tracking something only she could see. So Whitfield set up an experiment, and this is where it gets insane. He suspended tiny objects from threads around the hospital room, barely visible, swaying with the faintest air currents. No human eye should have been able to track them. But for 3 nights straight, the girl's gaze matched every oscillation perfectly. Even in near darkness, when sight should have failed, she was locked on. And that was just the beginning. Whitfield pushed further. What were her limits? He discovered she could detect microscopic shifts in temperature just by watching how the air bent. Cold, hot, currents invisible to everyone else, she mapped them like a machine. Then came the auditory tests. Brace yourself. The girl could hear things no one else in the room could, sounds so low they were nearly inaudible. During one trial, she paused mid-sentence and said, "There are footsteps in the corridor below." The problem? That corridor was 3 floors down. When the nurses checked, they found a man walking exactly where she said, and she even described his limp, his uneven gait, with chilling accuracy. This wasn't just sleeplessness anymore. This was evolution, or something far stranger. Whitfield wrote the words in his journal with shaking hands, a neurological phenomenon unknown to medicine. She wasn't just surviving without sleep. She was developing senses that shattered the boundaries of human perception. But Whitfield knew written notes weren't enough. If he was going to prove this to the world, he needed more. He needed something undeniable. That's when he summoned Charles Petton, one of London's most pioneering photographers, a man whose medical portraits were used across Europe to capture the unexplainable. Petton's mission: to take the one photograph that might finally reveal the truth about the girl who never slept. But here's the catch, and the reason this photo would remain locked away for 150 years. When the camera clicked, it didn't just capture the girl. It caught something else, something no one was supposed to see. And trust me, the biggest twist hasn't even come yet. You're about to witness the most disturbing photograph ever taken in the 1800s. And it all started with one October morning in 1868. Dr. Whitfield had a request, a strange one. He wanted a man named Petton, a legendary photographer obsessed with capturing what the human eye missed, to test his experimental lighting against the impossible, a little girl with eyes that didn't behave like anyone else. The studio was silent, except for the ticking of Petton's massive camera clock. He had engineered a system of multiple lights, angled to reveal the tiniest twitch of a face, micro-expressions, secrets the human mask tries to hide. This wasn't photography, it was a hunt. But the second the girl walked in, everything felt wrong. She didn't stumble, she didn't hesitate. She moved like a machine programmed for this exact moment. She sat in the chair, spine straight, eyes perfectly aligned with the lens. And then, wait for this, before Petton even adjusted the lights, she turned her head to the exact angle he was about to move them to, almost like she knew what was coming before it happened. Normally, these sessions dragged on for 20 painful minutes. Subjects shifted, sighed, fidgeted. But this girl, she sat frozen, motionless except for her eyes. They darted in tiny, precise patterns, like she was tracking something in the air that no one else could see. Petton had photographed hundreds of neurological patients, but his stomach twisted as the minutes passed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being photographed, observed, dissected, even when he ducked behind the camera, completely out of her line of sight. And then came the ultimate challenge, the 30-second exposure. For children, this was brutal. They coughed, blinked, flinched, ruining the shot. But this girl, she became a statue, total stillness. 30 seconds of terrifying perfection, her body unmoving but her eyes still alive, still mapping invisible patterns. 3 days later, Petton developed the plate, and what he saw should have been impossible. The image captured her eyes doing two things at once, staring directly into the camera and staring past it, into something far beyond. The result was a photograph so unsettling. Every person who looked at it reported the same feeling, like they were being watched and ignored simultaneously. But here's the thing, Petton swore this wasn't a trick of light. This wasn't a glitch. This was something he had never seen before in his entire career, and he would go to his grave claiming that this single photograph revealed something about human vision, something we weren't supposed to see. And the craziest part, that wasn't the last time this girl would terrify a room full of professionals. This photograph didn't just capture an image, it exposed something the human eye was never meant to see. When the plate was examined, doctors noticed details no one remembered from the session. Her face, locked in micro-expressions of constant tension, like she was wired to an invisible alarm. And her pupils, blown wide open in a way that didn't match any medical condition ever recorded. Dr. Whitfield was stunned. He packed the photograph and carried it across London, Paris, Vienna, begging the brightest medical minds for answers. But every single expert gave the same reaction: silence, confusion, and fear. No one had ever seen anything like it. But while the photo spread across Europe, the girl herself was changing in ways that made the picture look tame. After 3 months under non-stop observation, her abilities escalated into something straight out of a nightmare. She started predicting events with impossible accuracy. Minutes before a doctor entered the room, she would whisper his name. On clear blue afternoons, she would murmur, "Rain is coming," and 5 minutes later, water hammered the hospital roof. And then came the moment that broke the staff. She began repeating fragments of conversations happening in other rooms, locked rooms, far down the corridor. There was no way she could have heard them, yet her words matched perfectly. Dr. Whitfield was desperate for an explanation. Maybe her hearing was superhuman. Maybe she'd trained her senses to impossible levels. But when he ran controlled tests, the truth was undeniable. She wasn't just hearing, she was knowing. And then in December of 1868, nearly a full year without sleep, her body began to betray her secret. Her skin turned pale, but not like normal sickness. It was a paleness that looked like it was glowing from the inside out, as if her very biology was mutating. Her nails grew at double speed, forcing weekly clippings. And her hair, every strand that fell was finer, smoother, almost alien in texture. The hospital was now split in two, half convinced she was the future of human evolution, the other half convinced she was human at all. But the most disturbing transformation hadn't even happened yet. Her transformation wasn't stopping, it was accelerating. By now, her hair had turned brittle, but with an unnatural metallic shine, like strands spun from glass. The doctors ran blood tests, crude for the time, and what they found nearly made them drop their instruments. Her red blood cell count was off the charts, oxygen levels far beyond anything human. The chemistry of her blood didn't match any known condition. It was as if her biology was rewriting itself. And then came the changes you couldn't measure with a vial. The girl spoke less and less, every sentence cut down to razor-sharp fragments. But when she did speak, her words landed like precision strikes, phrases too calculated, too deliberate, like a machine selecting language. And the content of those words, terrifying. This child, barely old enough to read simple stories, began talking about historical events, complex science, even human anatomy, with an accuracy that outpaced the educated men in Whitfield's own lecture halls. At first, the doctor suspected a trick. Maybe she'd gotten her hands on medical texts or overheard lectures. But after a thorough investigation, the truth slammed shut. She had no access to anything beyond nursery books. When Whitfield asked her directly, "Where does this knowledge come from?" her answer froze the room. "The night visitors teach me, while I observe." Then, exactly 1 year into her condition, January 1869, the phenomenon escalated into something beyond science. She began slipping into what Whitfield called episodes of conscious absence. For anywhere between 15 minutes and 2 hours, her body stayed awake, responsive to touch, to sound, but her mind, gone. Her pupils blew wide until her eyes turned pure black, empty voids staring back at the world. Even scarier, she didn't just sit idle. During these black-eyed states, she could perform tasks with inhuman precision, writing at blistering speeds, sketching with surgical accuracy. The drawings she left behind became a new obsession. Because they weren't childlike doodles, they were blueprints, perfectly scaled architectural designs of buildings no one in London had ever seen before. Geometry so precise it matched what only top universities taught. And some of the sketches, they showed structures that didn't even exist yet. Dr. Whitfield realized the impossible. She wasn't just seeing things no one else could. She was recording something ahead of her time. And the most terrifying part, she hadn't even revealed what the night visitors wanted. What came next turned the entire hospital upside down. The girl's drawings stopped being strange blueprints. They became maps of secrets. She was sketching the interiors of buildings that didn't exist on any public record, but that matched, down to the last corridor, the layouts of private medical institutions and hidden laboratories that only a handful of elites could access. When Dr. Whitfield handed these sketches to professional architects, the reaction was instant: perplexity, discomfort, shock. The structures weren't nonsense. They were functional, mathematically sound, but contained design elements decades ahead of their time. Staircases reinforced with methods not yet invented. Medical equipment powered by mechanical systems no engineer in 1869 had ever seen. It was like this child wasn't drawing from imagination. She was downloading the future. And then February hit, and with it the most terrifying phase yet. Her body began seizing into episodes of total muscular rigidity. She would sit upright, hands pressed to her knees, eyes locked on some invisible horizon. Hours passed with her body frozen, her breath nearly gone, her pulse so low it mimicked a coma, yet her mind stayed conscious, watching, waiting. And what happened during these frozen trances was worse than any nightmare. She started speaking in predictions, precise predictions, the death dates of terminal patients in other wards, weather changes weeks before they came. But the most terrifying, she began describing events that wouldn't happen for decades. She spoke of machines that would one day replace human limbs, of voices transmitted through invisible wires, of a world where cities glowed at midnight as if the sun had never set. Dr. Whitfield documented every word, building a file so disturbing it would later be whispered about as one of Victorian medicine's most forbidden archives. And years later, as history unfolded, detail after detail from her black-eyed trances proved true. By March of 1869, after more than a year of relentless observation, Whitfield knew he was no longer just treating a patient. He was holding onto a phenomenon that could rewrite the limits of science or destroy everything medicine thought it knew. And that's when he made a decision that would change everything. This is the moment a little girl's life was hanging by a thread, and a single experimental gamble was about to decide if she lived or never woke up again. In 1869, Dr. Whitfield faced an impossible choice. A child who hadn't slept in over 15 months was deteriorating fast. Nothing in medicine had ever worked. But then he uncovered a secret protocol out of France, a mix of substances so controversial, so dangerous that even mentioning it in London was enough to start a scandal. Laudanum, ether, and a mysterious plant compound, combined, they could force the brain into sleep, but on a child. It was practically unthinkable. This wasn't medicine. This was a high-stakes experiment that could either save her or kill her. Whitfield didn't decide alone. He consulted the top minds in London, Paris, Vienna. Every single one told him the same chilling truth. Her condition was so unprecedented, so terrifying, that normal treatments were useless. Experimental methods weren't just an option. They were the only option left. The family resisted for weeks, torn between horror and hope. But as they watched their daughter fatting, her small frame weakening, her eyes growing emptier each day, they made the most heartbreaking decision of their lives. They signed their consent. The date was set, April, a morning that would go down in medical history. The girl was moved into a specially prepared hospital room, the most advanced setup the Victorian world could muster. Strange monitors, precise instruments, a team of 6 doctors and nurses surrounding her like soldiers before battle. Every second counted. Every heartbeat felt like the ticking of a bomb. At exactly 9:00 a.m. the first dose was delivered. The room froze. Nurses gripped their notes. Whitfield's eyes locked on her pulse. Would this be the end? And then it happened. For the first time in over 15 months, her eyelids fell shut. The room erupted in disbelief. 2 minutes passed. 5 minutes, 10, she didn't stir. For over 2 hours, the impossible was happening. She slept. But it wasn't just ordinary rest. Her breathing slowed, steady for the first time in over a year. Her pulse dropped to normal levels. And then the most shocking sign of all, rapid eye movements, REM sleep, dreams. The doctors stared at each other in silence. They weren't just watching a child sleep. They were witnessing the very thing that had been stolen from her for more than a year, return. At 11:00 a.m., her eyes fluttered open, and what happened next stopped the room cold. Her face had transformed. The hard, unnatural tension that had frozen her features for months melted away. And then, something none of them were prepared for. She smiled. Not a forced, pained expression. A real smile. The first in months. The first sign that somewhere deep inside a child had returned. The silence broke when she turned her head, looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, and spoke her first words. But what she said would shock them all. When the girl first opened her mouth, the words stunned the doctors. "The night visitors are gone," she whispered. "They said they no longer need to observe me." The room went silent. Her parents froze. Everyone had heard her, but no one dared to speak. She blinked innocently, confused. She didn't realize what had happened. She asked if she had simply slept through the night. She had no awareness that she had been awake for over a year. And in the days that followed, it looked like a miracle. She played like a normal child. She laughed. She asked endless curious questions. And most importantly, she slept. 8 to 9 hours every night, her body falling into a rhythm it had been denied for so long. 1 week later, tests confirmed what their eyes already told them. Her pulse, her breathing, her energy levels, all perfectly normal. The terrifying sensory powers she once had, the ability to hear whispers through walls and sense movements no human should detect, gone. But the biggest shock, she remembered nothing. When questioned about the night visitors or her eerie predictions of future events, she looked genuinely puzzled, like they were speaking of a dream she had never dreamed. Dr. Whitfield had his theory. He believed her mind had erased the memories on purpose, a natural defense mechanism to protect her from the horror of what she had endured. 3 weeks of careful monitoring passed. The girl remained perfectly healthy. At last, Whitfield signed the discharge papers. The family left London and returned to their small town in northern England, free, at last, from the nightmare that had haunted them. And for months the letters poured in, updates filled with joy. The girl was thriving, going to school, making friends, living the childhood she had nearly lost forever. For the first time in years, everything was normal. But then the letters stopped. December 1869. Without warning, the family's correspondence ceased entirely. Whitfield sent letters, desperate for answers. None returned. Weeks passed, silence. And so he made a decision. He would go himself. Whitfield boarded a train, bound for the family's hometown. He had no idea what he was about to find. When Whitfield finally arrived in northern England, he expected answers. Instead, he found a nightmare. According to local records, the family hadn't just vanished, they had erased themselves. One night, without warning, they disappeared completely. No belongings taken, no farewell to neighbors, no trace of where they had gone. And that's when things got even stranger. Town residents swore they'd seen shadowy figures drifting through the streets between 3 and 5 a.m., always heading toward the family's house. Others claimed they heard the girl's voice, whispering and laughing in her room long past midnight. But when neighbors asked about it, her parents dismissed it as sleep-talking. Except it wasn't sleep-talking. On the final night before the disappearance, the entire street saw something unforgettable. Strange blue lights flickering inside the girl's room, not the warm glow of candles or oil lamps, but a pulsing, mechanical luminosity, flashing in patterns, almost like a code being sent into the night. Whitfield dug deeper, interviewing every witness he could find, and what he discovered chilled him to the core. The girl's miracle recovery. It hadn't lasted. In the weeks before the vanishing, she had slipped back into fragments of her old condition. Her casual remarks turned into predictions again, small, almost innocent comments about things that hadn't happened yet, but always came true. Worse, her sleep was failing again. Each night she slept less, sometimes only an hour or two. A neighbor recalled looking out his window and seeing her motionless at her own, staring into the empty street as if waiting for something only she could see. The parents tried to explain it away. She just likes to check if everything is safe, they told him, but Whitfield knew better. These weren't the habits of a child. They were signs, signs that the night visitors had come back. And in that moment, Whitfield realized a horrifying truth. The girl hadn't been cured, she had only been borrowed back by the ordinary world. But something or someone was still watching. What happened next turned this case from disturbing into downright terrifying. After returning to London, Whitfield was shaken to his core. The family was gone without a trace. No records, no witnesses, no sightings. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. But just when he thought the trail was cold, the first letter arrived. It was March 1870. No return address, no name, just a folded sheet containing a drawing. Whitfield froze. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the girl. The sketch showed the human nervous system, but not as science knew it. It revealed strange neural branches that looked less like biology and more like antennae. Antennae designed to receive something. Attached was a single note that read, Dr. Whitfield, the night visitors explained that some people are chosen to serve as observers. Sleep is a luxury observers cannot have. She is well, but she can no longer live among those who sleep. A friend. And that was only the beginning. By June 1870, another letter arrived, this one packed with predictions. Surgeries not yet invented, medicines that wouldn't exist for 50 years, brain theories so advanced they wouldn't surface until the 20th century. Whitfield tracked every single one, and as decades passed, they all came true. Every single one. Then came the letter that nearly broke him. In 1871, Whitfield opened an envelope to find a map of London, but not the London he knew. This was a future city, complete with bridges that hadn't been built, districts that didn't exist, and transportation systems that wouldn't appear for decades. It was like holding the blueprint of tomorrow in his hands. And Whitfield realized something chilling. Whoever was sending these letters wasn't just watching history unfold, they were decades ahead of it. But here's the part that will leave you speechless. They weren't isolated freaks, they were a network. The map didn't just show buildings and bridges, it lit up like a hunter's grid. 12 other markers across London, each one tied to a person who developed the same impossible condition. Each marker listed times and precise hours when that observer would be on duty. A 24-hour lattice of human eyes watching the city. Whitfield couldn't ignore it. He had to know. So he started going door to door, following the map like a detective in a race against time. His first stop, Whitechapel, a district of narrow streets, cheap lodgings, and whispered rumors. The address on the map pointed to a tiny orphanage run by nuns. The Mother Superior answered with a prayer and a frown. At first she denied anything unusual. Then, under pressure, she admitted the orphanage had a child who hadn't slept in 6 months. They called it a miracle, a holy vigil, a soul consecrated to prayer. Whitfield asked to see the boy. What he found there was the mirror image of the girl's nightmare. The boy sat pale and motionless, eyes locked on a point no one else could see, breath quiet, reflexes sharp as a hawk's. He tracked movement with surgical precision. He heard things that shouldn't be heard. He described visitors the nuns swore they'd never seen. And then Whitfield mentioned the girl. The boy didn't hesitate. He knew her name. He knew the treatment. He recited details about Whitfield's experiment that no orphan could possibly know. "She told us about you," the boy said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "The night visitors say you're a good doctor, but you don't understand everything." Pause. That line should have detonated like a grenade in Whitfield's mind. The network wasn't accidental. These children were talking to each other, or someone was talking to them and relaying intelligence. Whitfield spent hours documenting the boy, his speech clipped, his knowledge precise, his attention surgically focused. The pattern matched the girl's case, but the specialties varied. Where she had uncanny visual and auditory reach, this boy exhibited a different suite of abilities and expertise, as if each observer had been tuned for a particular type of surveillance. One watched sounds, another watched structures, another watched people. Together they formed a living, breathing intelligence. The more Whitfield learned, the colder the room felt. These weren't random anomalies. They were nodes in a city-wide system, distributed, scheduled, coordinated. Whoever, whatever had created them had designed roles. They had set shifts. They had built a watch that never slept. And just when Whitfield thought the ledger couldn't get darker, a final detail in the orphanage file punched him in the gut. The boy insisted he'd been taught by the same night visitors who taught the girl. He described lessons, diagrams, and schedules. He spoke of a purpose so matter-of-fact it felt monstrous. Whitfield closed his notebook and felt the sky tilt. This had stopped being a medical mystery. It was now a city under surveillance, run by unseen instructors who used children as their instruments. And the worst part, the map hinted that London was only the beginning. The biggest twist hadn't even arrived. You think this is a doctor's case file. You're wrong. It's the blueprint of a secret that watches the world while we sleep. Whitfield kept following the map like a man chasing a ghost, and what he found was nothing short of impossible. The boy in Whitecapel wasn't a one-off, he was a node, a sensor, a living instrument tuned to feel the world in ways normal people can't even imagine. Where the girl saw and heard beyond human limits, the boy felt vibrations, distant footsteps, the whisper of a carriage across a cobbled street, as if the earth itself were speaking to him. One house led to another. A mental asylum in Bethnal Green sheltered a young woman who hadn't slept in 3 years. A private hospital in Kensington kept records of a middle-aged man who'd lost sleep after toxic gas exposure and never regained it. At each address, Whitfield found the same pattern: uncanny abilities, razor-focus attention, knowledge of other observers they could never have met. They were not isolated anomalies, they were linked. Then the letters converged. In 1872, one anonymous envelope contained the biggest bombshell yet. The girl was alive, but not where anyone expected. She was living in a hidden enclave in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by other people like her. Not prisoners, not patients, a secret community, a covert institute where those who could no longer belong to ordinary life sheltered together and turned their impossible senses into research. According to the letter, they weren't just surviving. They were mapping things the rest of humanity couldn't perceive. Patterns of energy, currents of information, signals that ran under and through the world like invisible rivers. They cataloged them, trained with them, and used them to peer decades ahead. And here's the part that ripped Whitfield's notebooks in two. Their condition wasn't a freak accident of nature. It was caused. The anonymous writer called it external influences, forces that reached into nervous systems and rewired them into receivers and sentinels. Exposure, contact, a vector, not contagious like a fever but like an invitation. Whoever, whatever, had touched these people had given them the ability to watch what others could not. Whitfield's entire worldview tilted. Medicine had always treated the body as a closed book. Now the pages were being written from the outside. Cities became grids of living sensors. Children who should have been playing in yards were, in fact, standing watch for phenomena no Victorian mind had a name for. He kept digging. Every lead pointed outward to Europe, to other cities, to a network that spanned borders. The map on that first letter wasn't local, it was a pattern, a system, a plan. And just when Whitfield thought he'd reached the bottom of the rabbit hole, the letter added something that made his blood run cold. These observers were organized. They had shifts. They had roles. They had been taught. Wait for it, because the real question is not who taught them, but why. The biggest twist hasn't come yet. You think this is a Victorian medical mystery. You're about to learn it's a recruitment file for something older, something that's been whispering to humankind for centuries. The anonymous letters said the same thing in different words. Whatever touched these people had been present for generations, nudging, probing, sometimes invisible, but now it was making permanent changes. Why? To build a human network of eyes and ears, a grid that could sense shifts in reality itself long before ordinary science could catch up. They called them observers. They were early warning systems for threats too subtle for instruments, too slow to register until catastrophe was already rolling. Then the letter did something no sane document should do. It invited Whitfield in. It gave him a map, a time, and instructions to find a hidden community in the Scottish Highlands, a place where the Watchers lived and trained. Read it once and your skin crawled. Read it twice and your grip on normalcy started to loosen. Whitfield debated for months. He was a clinician, a man of charts and measured breath. He also wasn't stupid. He knew this smelled of trickery, of charlatans, or worse, madness. But curiosity is a dangerous fuel, and the file had already burned through every protocol he believed in. In August 1872, he finally did what no respectable physician should. He cleared his schedule, packed a single satchel, and boarded a train to the edge of the world. The trip was a gauntlet of rain and rock, a journey meant to disorient. Days of travel collapsed into a single night of waiting on a wind-bent field. The place the letter described looked like any abandoned croft, stone walls crumbling, a sagging roof, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Nothing about it screamed community. Nothing moved. So he did exactly what the envelope told him to do. He stood at the appointed spot and waited. The clock in his head ticked toward 3 in the morning, the same witching hour that had haunted every wound in this case. And then, like a scene cut from a nightmare, she appeared. Not the frightened child he had last seen in a hospital bed, but a 12-year-old who had been sharpened into something both human and not. She moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly when and where to appear. Her eyes were the same terrible eyes from Petton's plate, intense, ancient, accusing, and patient all at once. She didn't run to him or cry. She stepped out of the dark and said his name like a summons. Dr. Whitfield. The night visitors were right about you. You are ready. She led him across the weedy yard, past a stone slab that hid an entrance, and stopped at a trap door. She pressed her palm, and the world shifted. A section of earth slid away to reveal a staircase plunging into the dark. The smell that rose up was not mildew or rot. It was something else, metal and oil and the low, humming suggestion of machines. He should have turned and fled. He should have run back to the train, to gaslight and gas lamps and the delicate lie of normal life. But the scientist in him stepped forward. He descended. With every creaking step, the hair on his arms rose. With every footfall, the feeling that he had crossed an unseen threshold ratcheted higher. At the bottom of the stairs, the underground complex unfolded, not a single room, but corridors and chambers humming with purpose. Instruments lined benches, charts pinned to walls. Children, older now, disciplined and silent, moved with the mechanical grace of apprentices in a cult or a laboratory. They didn't look like patients. They looked like technicians in a project older than Whitfield's textbooks. She turned to him and her voice was steady, almost clinical. "We teach what we were taught," she said. "We watch so others may sleep." Whitfield felt something pry loose inside him. Awe, dread, and the sick understanding that his life's work had only been a small margin on a much larger ledger. The complex thrummed like a living thing, as if the very stone had memory. And somewhere beyond the last corridor, behind doors stamped with symbols he didn't yet understand, something waited that had been waiting a very long time. He inhaled. The trapdoor thudded shut behind him. The lamp in his hand reflected in 100 pairs of eyes. The girl nodded. "You wanted answers," she said. "Now you will see. But be warned, once you learn to look the way we do, you can't unsee." The air tightened. The countdown in his chest accelerated. The biggest twist hadn't arrived yet, and whatever it was behind the next door. "You thought this was a medical ward. You were wrong. It was a command center, humming with a light that shouldn't exist in the dark." The underground complex glowed with that same weird bluish luminosity Whitfield had seen in the family's house the night they vanished, and whatever powered it made the air feel electric. 20 people lived here, children, teenagers, adults, all with the same impossible tell. Eyes that barely blinked, movements cut to mechanical precision, attention like a spotlight fixed on invisible things. Whitfield's 3 days inside the compound shredded everything he thought he knew about biology. These weren't broken people. They were instruments. They spoke without speaking, not whispers, but a direct sharing of thought that made ordinary conversation feel clumsy and slow. They could sense the world at distances that would make a hound jealous. Subtle shifts in wind, a tremor in a distant foundation, the faintest frequency of sound nowhere else audible. Then came the capability that made his rational mind snap. They could perceive events before they happened, not prophecy, not guesswork, but cold, mechanical forecasts distilled from patterns the rest of humanity couldn't even see. The girl, taller now, shaped by years in this strange school, moved like a conductor. She told him the protocol hadn't cured her, it had taught her control. "You gave us the gift of temporary sleep," she said, eyes boring into his. "But you also taught us how to choose when to awaken. We can live in both worlds, the world of those who sleep and the world of observers." Then she proved it. She closed her eyes for what looked like a moment. 3 minutes later, she opened them, calm as a surgeon. She began to describe places he had never visited. A rally in Paris minutes earlier, a lab in Berlin testing a metal that had not yet been named, a thaw in a mountain range in Asia that was just beginning. Her descriptions were precise: names, faces, weather patterns, and details that were verifiable and impossibly current. Whitfield checked his notes, checked his watch, felt the earth tilt under the weight of what she'd said. Every fact she spoke matched news and reports he could later corroborate. She'd watched them happen while asleep. He watched others do the same. A man at a bench, eyes half closed, suddenly sketched the exact layout of a factory in Rotterdam he had never seen. A teenager, fingers barely moving, described the cadence of a train line 2 countries away. They operated like nodes in a distributed intelligence, each one tuned to a type of perception, each one feeding a larger map of data that together made the invisible visible. Whitfield filled pages with observations that would have made his colleagues laugh a year earlier. The observers could detect microscopic environmental changes at distance, communicate complex states of mind silently, and model future events by reading patterns of cause and effect as if the world were a machine and they the engineers. But the most unsettling truth whispered to him in the compound's fluorescent glow: this was not an accident. The observers had been altered, exposed to external influences that rewired nervous systems into receivers. They were not merely awake, they were tuned. They were organized. They had purpose. On his last night, as the bluish light hummed and the compound breathed like a giant lung, the girl leaned close and said, with a clarity that felt like a verdict, "We watch so others may sleep. But the world is changing. The watch must tighten." Whitfield left the Highlands with notebooks full of data and a gut full of dread. He had come for answers and found a functioning surveillance network that read the future like a ledger. The medical mystery had become a technological miracle and a moral problem that would follow him the rest of his life. And once again, the biggest twist hadn't come yet. This is where the case stops being a strange medical file and starts reading like a directive from another world. The observers didn't invent their story, they lived it. They told Whitfield, plainly and without melodrama, that the night visitors were not human. They described an intelligence that had shadowed humanity for centuries, patient, precise, and finally bold enough to rewrite biology itself. They said their condition wasn't a mistake. It was a program, a slow surgical preparation of selected nervous systems so humans could become instruments, sensors, translators, early warning nodes for changes in reality that ordinary science would miss until it was too late. Sleep, they explained, is a luxury observers cannot afford. Vigilance is their duty. That was the cold logic of the compound. Whitfield listened like a man watching his maps burn and remap themselves. Skepticism cracked against the evidence, so the girl walked him deeper into the machine. She led him to a room the community called the Watch, the heart of their work. It looked like a lab, but it behaved like a control center. Observers sat at stations, eyes soft and steady, each tuned to a domain. Whether patterns 2 oceans away, political tremors in capitals Whitfield had never visited, seismic whispers from mountains no one was currently climbing. Each station produced streams of impressions, not numbers, but felt certainties, which the girl aggregated into reports. Then, in a moment Whitfield later described as the strangest of his life, he was invited to witness a transmission. They showed him how the reports were sent to the night visitors through methods he couldn't parse. Rhythms in the blue light, tiny fluctuations in air, a choreography of attention that became a message. It was not language as he knew it. It was impressions, images, directives pressed directly into mind space. On his final night, they did something no Victorian physician could have prepared for. They let him try. He sat in the room, heartbeat loud, rational thought boiling like a kettle on a low flame, and the world tilted. Without speech, without blinking lights or written code, Whitfield found presences fold into his awareness. They weren't voices. They were impressions, cold, crystalline suggestions and vast patterns that resolved into meaning only when he surrendered the way he thought. The information that came through was technical, terrifying, and oddly mundane. Outlines of scientific advances yet to occur, shifts in ecosystems that would ripple into famine zones, political flashpoints decades away. He saw clouds of probability collapse into outcomes. He watched causal threads pull events forward like puppets on strings. It was not prophecy. It was pattern reading at a scale his instruments could never touch. When he came out of it, hours later and shaking, his pen trembled on the page. He had received names of techniques, descriptions of materials, sketches of processes no chemist of his day could conjure. And yet, years later, many of those exact developments would arrive in the world as if predicted. The experience rewired him. A scientist who had trusted measurable causality now carried impressions of an intelligence that navigated time by reading its rhythms. Before he left, the girl leaned forward and said something that felt less like a sentence and more like an instruction. We watch so others may sleep, but the watch is changing. The visitors say the pattern is accelerating. Be ready. Whitfield left the Highlands with notebooks, with proofs his peers would ridicule, and with a single, unbearable certainty. Whatever the night visitors were, they were not passive. They were preparing, organizing, and training people to read the world in ways that made blind certainty dangerous. And because this file refuses a tidy ending, because every answer opens another vault, remember this. The biggest twist hasn't come yet. You think this ends with a tidy cure. Think again. This next act rips the story wide open. Whitfield walked away from the Highlands a different man, and not just because his notebook was full. The visit rewired him. The world he thought he knew, neat, measurable, solvable, had blurred at the edges. He returned to London with something heavy in his satchel. The original 1868 photograph Petton had taken, plus pages of the girl's own notes and documents. She handed them to him like a promise and a warning. This shows what you couldn't see, she said. If you look close, you'll find the visitors. Whitfield did look. He hauled out every optical toy a Victorian lab could muster and stared until his eyes watered. What he found made the hair rise on his arms. The plate contained anomalies, tiny reflections in her pupils that didn't match anything in the studio, little glints that shouldn't exist. But that was only the start. Under specific light and a hungry magnifying glass, those strange glints organized. Patterns emerged, not random specks but recurring shapes, lines that intersected and curled into characters, like a hidden script pressed into silver. It was as if the photograph had been used as a canvas to hide a message, coded information, only revealed when you forced the image to relinquish its secrets. Whitfield's hands shook as he traced them. Someone or something had left a fingerprint in light. Then the letters came steady at first. 1873, 1874. Postmarks, pages, updates from the Highlands confirming what he had glimpsed. Predictions fulfilled, anomalies tracked, the observer's work logging outcomes with grim accuracy. Each envelope was another mic drop. Weather events predicted, political tremors flagged, technical details that later unfurled into real science. The data was impossibly precise. Whitfield checked and rechecked. The math didn't lie. But then the file goes dark. In 1875, the letters stopped. No warning, no final communique, just silence where there had been a pulse. Whitfield waited. He wrote. He sent emissaries. Nothing came back. The photograph sat under glass on his desk like a lit fuse, the coded symbols staring back as if daring him to decipher the last line. So here's the cliffhanger that will keep you awake. The girl told him the photograph carried more than proof. It was a map, a message, and a lock. Whitfield had cracked part of it. He had watched prophecy turn into reality. He had been given a view into a plan decades in the making. And then the plan went quiet. Count the dates. March, June, August 1872, the world rearranged itself around those markers. Then 1875, the silence. Tick, tick. The biggest twist hasn't come yet. He opened the Highlands gate and found a ghost town, and a note in a handwriting he knew like a pulse. Dr. Whitfield, our work in this phase has been completed. The observers have been redistributed to locations where they will be most needed in the coming years. The photograph you possess contains sufficient information for those who will know how to interpret it. Take good care of it. Your eternal patient. That line should have been the end. Instead, it was a detonator. Whitfield returned to London carrying questions the size of cathedrals and a single plate that refused to be just a picture. He spent the rest of his career listening to its silence and scratching notes into margins no one else would read. The Royal College of Physicians locked the files away and stamped them restricted, because once you look at what's inside, there's no polite way to explain it to the average mind. Decades later, science caught up with curiosity. New analyses, methods impossible in 1868, confirmed what Whitfield had only dared to suspect. Under the glare of modern optics, the photograph leaked secrets. Light patterns arranged like language, symbols trapped in silver halide, mathematical lattices folded into the shadows. Pattern recognition algorithms peeled back layers and found structures that mirrored knowledge from the 20th century. Neurology, quantum oddities, mathematical forms no 19th century hand should have encoded. Spectroscopy showed chemical traces in the emulsion that, by every account, should not have existed on Earth in 1868. Elements synthesized only a century later were whispering from the plate like a message left ahead of its time. Researchers who traced the footprints back through history found echoes. Medical casebooks from the 18th and 19th centuries were full of notes labeled madness or possession, descriptions of patients who never slept, who watched, who knew things they should not. When you sweep those dusty pages with modern eyes, a pattern begins to form. The incidence of these anomalies spikes with the industrial age. a strange synchrony with the rise of factories, wires, and chimneys. It looks as if something in the environment, or something that rode the wave of industrial change, began turning a few nervous systems into instruments. The theories multiply like rumors in a fever dream. Some say it's accelerated evolution, an emergent state triggered by electromagnetic storms and the new geometry of a wired world. Others insist the observers are evidence of contact, non-terrestrial intelligences reaching through flesh to set up a human grid of watchers. A third camp argues these people access levels of reality most of us never touch. Sleep would cut that access, so they were engineered to remain awake, perpetually tuned to invisible frequencies. Whatever you call it, the result is the same. The girl who never slept sits at the center of one of the strangest, best documented puzzles in neurological history. Modern neuroimaging has found contemporary echoes, brain activity patterns in current patients that hum with the same strange signature Whitfield inked into his notebooks. Teams running scans now see distributed networks firing in ways classical neurology didn't predict, circuitry that behaves less like solo neurons and more like an antenna array. Where 19th century tools saw nothing but normal vitals, 21st century machines see choreography, maps of attention, sustained oscillations, cross-regional synchrony that looks suspiciously like coordination. And the photograph, it keeps giving. Layered analysis has identified mathematical scaffolding embedded in the light and dark, multi-dimensional code stored in silver and shadow. Spectral fingerprints point to materials that were not available in Whitfield's time. Elements later synthesized in modern labs show up in trace amounts within the emulsion itself. It's as if the plate was a hard drive burned a century too early. When historians went back through the archives, they found more than coincidences. Similar coded plates, sketches that matched the observer's blueprints, and clinical notes describing people who behaved like nodes in a human network long before anyone thought to look for a network. Demographers mapped outbreaks of insomnia-turned-observer across industrial cities and found they clustered where smokestacks and pylons reoriented the landscape, as if the new geography of progress had also become the wiring for a different kind of surveillance. No single theory fits every fact. Some smart people prefer a scientific explanation, environmental triggers creating rare neurological phenotypes. Others prefer an extraterrestrial reading, external intelligence modifying a few humans as instruments. Still others propose metaphysical frames, that these observers slip into layers of reality most of us leave behind each night when we sleep. Each theory lands with a different moral weight, but they all agree on one thing: the watchers were never accidental. Someone or something curated them, trained them, and organized them into a lattice that could see what the rest of humanity could not. Whitfield's notebooks, once secret, became a touchstone for a small, careful community of researchers who treated the case like a strange relic and a manual at once. They confirmed many of his original observations, matched predictions the girl had made, and mapped the distribution of similar cases across centuries. The more they learned, the more the image looked less like a portrait and more like an instruction manual for a hidden infrastructure of perception. And if you think this is academic, think again. The real terror is practical, a network of people who can perceive before events unfold, who can map the faintest shifts in climate and politics, who can anticipate technological leaps years before they happen. That's power. That's a watchful system running beneath ordinary life. That's a private intelligence no one elected and no one can see until you know where to look. So what do we do with a photograph that contains maps of the future, elements from the future, and the fingerprints of a program that trained humans to read reality? We study it. We hide it. We argue about it. We lock it in archives and stamp it restricted. We pretend we can forget it. But Whitfield never forgot. He spent the rest of his life with that plate under glass, watching a picture that watched back, and cataloging the tiny tremors in history that matched the watcher's predictions. Others picked up the thread, and their work kept surfacing strange coincidences. An advance predicted decades earlier, a pattern of environmental change flagged before instruments could detect it. And now you know the secret everyone tried to bury, that the world once held, and perhaps still holds, a layer of observers, humans retooled into sensors by influences older than industry, organized into a silent network whose job was to watch so others could sleep. The photograph is tangible proof, the archived letters are testimony, and the modern evidence hums quietly in lab signals. If you're waiting for the final twist, here it is. The Watchers left clues, not threats. They distributed themselves where they were most needed, and then they vanished into the folds of history. But the system they built kept ticking. It adapted. It resurfaced in labs, in letters, in the quiet primes of modern scanners. The greatest danger isn't that they exist, it's that we can now see the pattern, and once you see the grid beneath the world, you can never stop looking. Keep your eyes open. The photograph is still watching. This isn't just an old medical footnote. It's a live wire humming through history and into our labs today. Modern neuroimaging pulled back the curtain and found the same weird fingerprints Whitfield scribbled about. Structural shifts in brain regions that handle sensing the world and tracking time. In plain terms, the brain isn't just different in these people. Parts of it are retooled to perceive things most of us never notice. And the strangest part, some of the people scanned today report the exact same experiences the 19th century records described, feeling invisible presences, numbing events before they happen, sensing threads of causality like a map. This isn't only a Victorian oddity. It's a phenomenon that reappears, rare but persistent, across centuries. Science arguing rooms split in two. One camp says, these are explainable pathological states. The other answers, no, we're seeing latent human capacities our textbooks never accounted for. Both sides stare at the same data and walk away with different fears. Either we're missing huge pieces of neurology, or we're waking to abilities that change what it means to be human. That's why the 1868 photograph still matters. It's not just a creepy portrait. It's the clearest, most thoroughly documented hinge in this entire mystery. Researchers keep returning to it because it ties historical medicine, uncanny neurological cases, and big philosophical questions about perception into a single stubborn knot. The photograph still goes on brief, controlled display, always with a warning. People who stand too long in front of it report the same old feelings. Prickling skin, a sudden sense of being watched, the eerie sensation that the girl's eyes shift or trace you if you don't move. Psychologists don't dismiss those reports. Some analyses actually suggest the image's light and composition patterns can subtly alter viewers' perception. Modern digital work has shown the plate contains layered structures that interact with how our brains process faces and gaze. In other words, the picture might not just show something, it might affect whoever looks at it. That could explain why the photograph stayed locked away for decades. Not because people feared ideas, but because the image itself had an effect on anyone who stared too long. But the implications run far deeper than a museum warning sign. The girl's legacy forces a brutal question. What if some pathologies are actually gateways to modes of perception we haven't let ourselves learn. What if a brain that never sleeps is not just broken, but tuned to a frequency most of us tune out every night? That possibility rearranges ethics, medicine, and power. A network of people who can sense what's coming, who can map subtle environmental shifts and political tremors, changes the game for governments, for scientists, for anyone who cares, who controls knowledge of the future. And remember, the data is real. Contemporary scans show patterned brain activity that looks less like random noise and more like coordinated antennas. Epidemiology links outbreaks of these cases to the industrial era's altered environments. Cryptic plates and notebooks line archives in locked rooms. The watchers didn't vanish. They dispersed, they adapted, and their signatures keep surfacing in lab reads and buried documents. So what are we left with? A photograph that behaves like a key, a set of modern brains that hum to the same strange tune, and a question that refuses to be shrugged off. Are we looking at rare neurological illness, evidence of contact with something beyond human, or an emergent form of perception unlocked by the changes humans themselves made to the world? Pick your theory, all of them have consequences. But here's the real kicker. Once you know the pattern exists, you can't unknow it. The grid is visible. The nodes can be found. And that changes everything about how we understand the past and how we might prepare for what's coming next. Stay sharp. The photograph is still watching, and the biggest twist, it hasn't shown itself yet. What if I told you there's a single photograph from 1868 so disturbing, researchers say it might hold the secrets of reality itself? And what if I told you the girl in that photo never slept a single night of her life? For over 150 years, scientists have been chasing her mystery, and the deeper they dig, the stranger it gets. Her predictions about the future were eerily accurate. Her senses went beyond human limits, and she swore she was in contact with intelligences not from this earth. Wait until you hear what researchers discovered hidden in her eyes. Modern technology keeps tearing this mystery wide open. Every scan of that ancient photograph reveals new layers, strange patterns of light, coded symbols, even anomalies that shouldn't exist in the 19th century. Some experts believe future breakthroughs will expose something even more shocking, that her very existence wasn't an accident, but part of a bigger design. But here's the twist. There is still no final answer. The case of the girl who never slept isn't just an unsolved medical mystery. It's a reminder that reality itself might be far stranger than we dare imagine. Each time we advance in neuroscience or technology, her story rises again, daring us to question the limits of perception, consciousness, and human evolution itself. Her photograph isn't just a portrait, it's a time bomb of unanswered questions. Look into her eyes and you don't just see a child, you see a presence, a warning, a puzzle meant to outlive centuries. Some call her proof of humanity's hidden potential. Others say she's a chilling example of why we should never trust extraordinary claims. But whether you believe or not, one thing is undeniable. Her gaze still cuts across time. And here's the most haunting part. Those eyes that never blinked in life will never blink in death. Forever locked in that photograph, staring back at anyone brave enough to meet her gaze. The girl who never slept is no longer just a Victorian medical case. She's a symbol of the unknown, a living riddle, waiting for the day we finally unlock what she represents. 150 years later, she's still watching, still waiting, still challenging us to question everything we think we know about reality itself. So if you're brave enough to keep digging into history's most disturbing mysteries, hit that subscribe button, because the next case we uncover might be even darker than this one.